The morning Craig looked me in the eyes and told me I lived in my own house on their charity. I was sitting at the table I had built myself, in the house I had raised with my own hands, brick by brick, over 5 years. He stood before me, arms folded, with the certainty of a man who believes he has already won and no longer needs to disguise it. I said nothing. I finished my tea, set the cup down on the table, and stood up slowly. 32 hours later, Mr. Pemberton rang the doorbell, and the world Craig had imagined for himself began to come apart.
To understand this story, you need to know what this house actually is. Not a building, not an address in some register. It is the only thing on this earth that I created from nothing, from money I had saved for years, from weekends spent laying foundations while others rested, from the plans Dorothy and I spread across the kitchen table and sometimes spotted with red wine. It is the house where our daughter learned to walk, the house where Dorothy died. Anyone who tells me I live here by their charity has never in their life built anything worth keeping.
Before I go any further, if you are watching this for the first time, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. It never stops moving me to see how far these stories travel. Some of you write from places I have never visited and yet understand exactly what I mean. That is why I tell them. Now, back to Arthur Whitfield, that is me, and to the story that began because I was too generous and did not see early enough what was quietly taking shape inside my own home. I am 70 years old, retired civil engineer, a widower for 6 years. Dorothy died on a Friday evening in November, quietly, without drama, the way she did everything in her life. After that, I lived alone in this house for 3 years, and I will not pretend it was easy. Not because of the silence. I had always known silence. It was difficult because every corner carried something of hers. The kitchen tiles she chose from a market in Devon, the oak shelf I built for her books, the rose bush she planted in the back garden, which blooms every June as though she left it careful instructions. When Helen rang and asked whether she and Craig could move in temporarily, I said yes without a moment's hesitation. Craig had run his second business into the ground, and they needed time, stability, solid ground beneath their feet. I thought, she is my daughter. This is my family. What else would I do? I cleared the spare room, bought fresh bedding, and cooked Helen's favorite meal that first evening. I still remember how Craig thanked me that night, how he said I was a good man. That sentence sounds different in my memory now, as though he already knew exactly what he intended to do. The first sign came 3 weeks in. I walked in from the garden, and the sitting room looked different. The sofa was no longer where Dorothy had placed it, in the same position for 20 years, never shifted an inch. Craig had rearranged everything. When I asked why, he said it flowed better now. He was smiling. I looked at the room that no longer felt mine and said nothing. I told myself it was a small thing, that people settle in and need their space. I did not yet understand that this was not carelessness. It was the opening gesture of a long and calculated takeover. 4 months later, my workshop had gone. Not exactly gone. My tools were in boxes in the garage, neatly packed, as though someone had organized a quiet funeral for them. Craig had converted the back room into an office. New desk, second monitor, a sign on the door that said "Study." He mentioned it only after everything was already installed and in place. I stood before my boxed saws and planes and tried to be fair to him. He works from home, I told myself. He needs the space. But something in me registered clearly. He no longer asks. He informs me afterwards, or says nothing at all.
At a dinner with family friends, he interrupted me 3 times in the same conversation. Not in passing, deliberately, with the tone of someone establishing a hierarchy before witnesses. The guests noticed. I saw it in their faces, that brief discomfort people feel when they witness a humiliation and do not know whether to intervene or keep staring at their plates. I let him speak. I continued eating. But that evening, I began to see things I had been choosing not to see. Craig was no longer behaving like a guest. He was behaving like an heir who had already taken possession of what was not his. Then he took control of the household finances. He presented it as a practical arrangement. He was earning again. He would cover the running costs. I was not to worry about a thing. It sounded like consideration, and at first I took it that way. But gradually I understood what it truly meant. He had installed himself as the functional head of the household. Bills went out in his name. Tradesmen called him, not me. The neighbor knocked on his door when he needed something. I had become a supporting figure in my own home, politely tolerated, excluded from decisions, slowly written out of my own life. The garden fence was replaced one morning without my knowledge. A tree felled. The rose bush Dorothy had planted that first spring after we moved in. A room repainted in a cold gray she would never have chosen. Each time I found out afterwards. Each time there was a plausible explanation. And each time something tightened inside me. Not anger, but something colder and clearer. The knowledge that I was no longer the real inhabitant of this place. That I had become, in my son-in-law's eyes, a piece of furniture. Something around which one makes plans and changes without ever thinking to ask. I heard him one Tuesday evening on the phone in the back garden. I was in the kitchen, the window open a crack. He spoke quietly, but the evening was perfectly still. I made out most of what he said, and then I heard the sentence that changed everything. Once the old man signs, it all goes into Helen's name. He was talking about my house. He had a timeline and someone he had been planning this with. I stayed motionless behind the door for several minutes. Then I set down the tea towel and went upstairs. I sat beside Dorothy's photograph and stayed there until well past midnight. The following morning, I rang Mr. Pemberton. Not to complain, not to seek advice. I already knew what I wanted. I needed only to know whether the law gave me what I required. Pemberton has managed my affairs for 30 years and knows every detail of my financial and legal position. When I told him what I had heard and what I intended to do, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said calmly, "Arthur, the house is yours. It has always been yours. Let us talk this through carefully." I wrote down the appointment, hung up, and had a quiet breakfast for the first time in weeks. Some of you may wonder why I had not acted sooner. The honest answer is simply this: because Helen is my daughter, my only daughter. I thought if I had patience, if I gave space, Craig would eventually understand where he stood. I was wrong. There are people to whom you give space and who fill it with gratitude. And there are people to whom you give space and who immediately mark it as their own territory. Craig was the second kind. It took me longer than it should have to accept that, but I accepted it in time, and that is what mattered. Mr. Pemberton confirmed what I had hoped. The title deeds were registered exclusively in my name since the house was built, with no ambiguity.
No shared obligations, no tenancy agreements, no recognized rights for Craig or Helen. They lived here as occupants at will, a legal position with a very precise meaning under English property law. He explained the notice requirements, the statutory periods, and the provisions for expedited action. I listened the way I used to listen in technical briefings, calm, precise, without visible emotion. I asked him to prepare a draft notice, not to send it yet, just to have it ready. I also contacted an old acquaintance, a retired barrister I had known from my professional years in the industry. Without mentioning names, I described the situation to him. He confirmed Mr. Pemberton's assessment and added something I had not anticipated. If Craig used my property address in planning applications without my express written consent, that could constitute an unlawful assertion of property rights, a legally valid trigger for the expedited notice procedure. I thanked him, drove home, and waited. I did not have to wait long. Craig was an impatient man, and impatient men who believe they have already won make decisive mistakes sooner than they expect. The confirmation arrived 4 weeks later by post. Craig had submitted a planning application to the local council for a rear extension, with my property address registered in his name as the applicant. My property, my address, without my name, without my signature, without my knowledge or consent of any kind. I placed the letter carefully on my desk. I rang Mr. Pemberton and said only, "It is time." He knew immediately what that meant. We had been preparing the envelope for weeks and waiting for this precise moment. Craig had triggered it himself with a form he considered an innocent formality. Meanwhile, Craig had already celebrated his imagined victory. He invited several couples for dinner, a long table, good bottles, the air of a confident host. He took them on a tour of the house, as though it were his personal gallery. He spoke of the planned extension, of renovations he envisioned, of the future of the property. I sat at the table, ate, and listened. At one point he gestured towards me and said I was the fixture they had inherited with the house. The guests laughed. I raised my glass. I said nothing. I was thinking only of the sealed envelope at Mr. Pemberton's office. 2 days after that dinner, Mr. Pemberton arrived in person at the front door. It was a Tuesday morning. Craig was at work. The children were at school. Helen answered the door. I was not there. I was at the churchyard leaving fresh flowers on Dorothy's grave, as I do every other Tuesday without fail. Pemberton handed Helen the sealed envelope, introduced himself calmly, and asked her to read the contents at her own pace. Helen rang me 40 minutes later. I did not answer. I placed the flowers on Dorothy's grave and drove home slowly, taking every turn with deliberate care. The envelope contained the formal notice to quit, grounded in the documented unauthorized use of my property address in a planning application submitted to the local council without my knowledge or consent. The vacate period, 48 hours, supported by the expedited provision for unlawful assertion of ownership rights over another person's registered property. Included were Mr. Pemberton's full legal advice, the certified copy of the title deeds, and a letter written by hand for Helen alone. No attack, no accumulated list of grievances, only one sentence, the only one I owed her. I still love you, but this house is mine. Craig rang me. I let it ring out. He rang again. I let it ring. On the third attempt, I answered and said only, "Speak to Mr. Pemberton." Then I hung up. He called a solicitor friend who reviewed the documents within an hour. The solicitor rang Craig back. What he said I do not know at first hand, but Helen told me later in a quiet voice. He told Craig there was nothing to be done. The documentation was entirely sound and legally watertight. Craig spent the night searching for an opening. There was none. He had lost a house that had never been his.
Helen wrote to me that night with 6 messages, one after another. I read every one.
She asked whether I was certain of what I was doing, whether we could talk before it was too late. She wrote that the children were confused and frightened. I replied the following morning, briefly and without coldness. The children are always welcome. So are you. Craig decides for himself whether he finds his way back. I sent the message, made my tea, and looked out at the garden. The rose bush was there. It was one of those early summer mornings when the light falls just so, and you understand everything. They left within 36 hours. I was not in the house while they packed. I had left Helen the spare key and gone to an old friend who lives nearby. When I returned, the house was empty of them, but full of what they had left. A few forgotten boxes in the hallway, a child's jacket on the hook, a jar of marmalade in the fridge. I put the jacket aside for the next visit with the grandchildren. The rest I left in place. I walked through every room slowly, one after another, like someone rereading an old and important book from the very first page. The first thing I did was return my tools to the workshop. Every saw, every plane, every hammer, back in its proper position, as I had done for 20 years. Then I carried the desk out and left it at the curbside. After that, I pushed the sofa back to the spot where Dorothy had always wanted it. The very place Craig had moved it from without asking anyone. I know that is sentimental. I know furniture does not bring anyone back. But when I pushed the sofa into its old place, the house breathed differently, more quietly, the way it used to before any of this began. 3 weeks later, the grandchildren came. I had arranged it through Helen's sister, the one person who had known what I was planning from the start, and the only one who never hesitated to say, "You are right, Arthur, and you must do it." The children arrived after school, with rucksacks and loud feet on the kitchen tiles, and I opened the door and held each of them without saying a word about what had happened. We made pancakes together. The eldest asked where the desk in the back room had gone. I told him calmly it had never belonged there. He shrugged and carried on eating. Helen and I spoke properly for the first time 2 months later. She rang on a quiet Sunday morning, without Craig in the background. She was not crying. She said only, "I know I should have stepped in much earlier." I answered, yes, not with cruelty, simply with honesty. It was the most truthful sentence we had exchanged in years, perhaps longer than that. I invited her for lunch, and she came. We sat at the table I had built myself, ate together, spoke about her mother, about the children, sometimes about nothing in particular. It was the beginning of something, still small, still fragile, but real. I have not spoken to Craig again, and I do not expect to. This is not bitterness. I carry nothing of him that weighs on me. But there are things that were said which should not have been said. "You live here because we allow it," that is what he told me. In my house, at my table, in front of my daughter. Those words have no shared future between us, and I am completely at peace with that. Without meaning to, he gave me the clearest thing I have had this decade, the absolute certainty that I had to act and that I had waited long enough.
The house still stands. The rose bush blooms. The workshop smells of wood and oil. Every morning I make my tea by the window that looks onto the garden, the same window from which I watched Dorothy gardening for years, in silence, without her knowing I was there watching. I have lost more in this house than most people lose in a lifetime, and I have built here more than can ever be measured in square footage. What Craig never understood is that ownership does not begin in the title deeds. It begins in the hands that created something, and in the heart that truly paid for it. I do not talk much about this period, not because it still hurts. That hurt is old and quiet now. I do not talk about it because the things that matter do not need an audience to remain true. But sometimes, when the grandchildren are here and the house fills again with voices and small feet, I think, perhaps that is the real victory. Not the 48 hours, not the document, but that this house still stands, still sounds, still smells the way it always did, and that I am still inside it, as on the first day, as Dorothy always imagined and wanted it to be. There are people who say I waited too long. Others say I should never have let things come that far. Both may be partly right, I do not deny it. But I am not a man who acts before he is certain, and I am not a man who punishes without a concrete, provable cause. Craig gave me that cause himself, through his own impatience and disregard. The rest I handled without detours or unnecessary drama. To anyone who asks whether I have forgiven him, I have stopped thinking about him entirely. That is more peace than any act of forgiveness could give me. Patience is not weakness. Now it is your turn. Write to me in the comments. If someone you had welcomed into your home, the home you built and paid for yourself, looked you in the eyes and said you lived there by their charity, what would you have done? Would you have acted sooner than I did? Or would you have waited for the precise legal moment? And a question that genuinely interests me. Did Craig deserve a second chance? Or were the 48 hours exactly what a man like him needed in order to finally understand something he should have known from the very first day? Now it is your turn. Write to me in the comments. If someone you had welcomed into your home, the home you built with your own hands and paid for yourself, looked you in the eyes and told you that you lived there by their charity, what would you have done? Would you have acted sooner than I did? Or would you have waited, as I did, for the precise legal moment? And a question that genuinely interests me. Did Craig deserve a second chance? Or were the 48 hours exactly what a man like him needed in order to finally understand something?